set of regimented rules. I'm amazed how much this love has touched my life. And the commitment that we share is a welcome sacrifice. This must be sweet fatal attraction. My lifelong day we're destined. Love is strong, it just brings out the passion I never knew was here in me. And I love you just because I love you, just because I do. My darling, you. And most is more than words can help me say. I love you. I love you. I love you. Just because you're you. Just because you're you. You're a diamond in my mind, a treasure found, a precious gem to me. You're so nice to have around. I'm so glad I took the path that led to this. And it's amazing loving you. I'm doing things I never thought I'd do. I don't know, there ain't no explanation why I'm sharing all that lasts this way. I won't try to uncover the reasons. I'll use these words to simply say I love you just because I love you, just because I do. Yeah, darling, you. And most of all the words can help me say I love you. I love you. I love you, baby. Could it be that as much as this that meets the eye? Maybe that's the reason why. All I know is when I'm in your arms, it feels alright. I hold on tight and I come alive. I love you just because I love you. You're right to love you, darling. And most of all the words can help me say I love you.
Okay. So you want it on this side? Okay. On this shoulders.
I look back on all those good times we once shared, and I must have been blind just to think I'd find someone new, one who'd love me better than you.
Hey, Arya. Is this
Well, it may come
Good evening. I'm Dr. Anthony WHUT, and I currently serve as the Provost and Chief Academic Officer at Howard University. And it is certainly my honor and pleasure to welcome you to the Gwendolyn and Colbert King Endowed Lecture Series in Public Policy. And our guest this evening is Ms. Kristen Clarke, who served as the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights in the U.S. Department of Justice. And it is certainly my pleasure to turn the evening over to Ms. Donna Brazile, who currently serves as the chair for the King Lecture Series. Donna, turning it over to you.
Thank you so much, Provost WHUT, for your kind words and introduction and your leadership here on the campus at Howard University. It is with great honor that we bring forward another special guest here today with the King Lecture Series. This is, as you all know, a very important season. And during Women's History Month, we wanted to invite someone who has made history in her own right. Assistant Attorney General Kristen Clarke has been in this leadership role now for over 1 year. She has been an amazing leader, serving as the Assistant Director for Civil Rights, and we know that she has so much to do, but she wanted to come and share some of her work over the past year, as well as to let us know what's going on as we speak today. Assistant Attorney General Clarke began her career as a trial attorney in the Civil Rights Division through the Department of Justice Honors Program. In 2006, she joined the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, where she helped lead the organization's work in the areas of voting rights and election law across the country. I think that's when I really got to know you. Ms. Clarke worked on cases defending the constitutionality of the Voting Rights Act, presented oral arguments to the D.C. District Court in Shelby County, Alabama versus Holder, and has provided testimony on federal and state voting rights legislation. In 2011, she was named the head of the Civil Rights Bureau for the New York State's Attorney General's Office, where she led broad civil rights enforcement actions. And under her leadership, the Bureau secured landmark agreements with banks to address unlawful redlining, employers to address barriers to address barriers to reentry for people with criminal backgrounds, police departments on reforms to policies and practices, major retailers on racial profiling of consumers, landlords on discriminatory housing policies, school districts concerning issues relating to the school to prison pipeline, and more. In 2015, Ms. Clarke was named the president and an executive director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under the Law, one of the nation's most prestigious civil rights organizations, founded at the request of President John F. Kennedy. There, she led the organization's legal work in courts across the country, addressing some of the nation's most complex racial justice and civil rights challenges. Assistant Attorney General Clarke was born in Brooklyn, New York, and after graduating from Rosemary Hall? She received her A.B. from Harvard University and her J.D. from Columbia Law School. We are so pleased to have her here on the historic campus of Howard University. Madam Assistant Attorney General, this is, as you well know, a very special occasion for us, especially with the confirmation of Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson now before the Senate Judiciary Committee. Let me also welcome our viewing audiences, both here in the studio and via the WHUT Facebook page. For those of you viewing online, please send your comments or questions to #KingLectureSeries. We will leave ample time for questions. Let's get started. Madam Director, it is a great honor to see you and to have you here on the campus. And as I mentioned before, this is a very historic time. Ketanji Brown Jackson was nominated by President Biden in January. She is now before the Senate Judiciary Committee. And as we see all of this history being made, especially history that you are well aware of, can you just give us your own personal reflection on this moment. I mean, you went to law school. You have been an amazing trailblazer in your own right, but tell us about this moment and what it all means.
Yeah. Well, first, Donna, let me just say thank you. It is wonderful to be here with you and wonderful to be here and be a part of this distinguished lecture series. This is truly a remarkable and historic week. Never before have we seen a Black woman sitting in that chair before the Senate Judiciary Committee being reviewed and evaluated for a seat on our nation's highest court. Our Attorney General, Merrick Garland, has talked about his own experience working alongside Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson. We know that she served as a public defender, and the only Supreme Court justice who's brought that lens to bear on the work was Justice Thurgood Marshall, who has special ties to Howard University.
That's correct.
And, you know, she brings an exemplary record to this role. She has served on every level of federal courts. She served at the trial court level. She served at the circuit court level, handling appeals. I think that I join the public in watching with great anticipation to see what happens here, but it would most certainly be historic for our nation to finally have a Black woman seated on the nation's highest court.
In one of the statements that she made, I think, when the president announced her nomination, she talked about Judge Constance Baker Motley. Did you ever have an opportunity to work with Judge Motley? And perhaps tell us a little bit more about what it means to be the first in terms of, you know, Judge Motley was the first Black woman to serve on the federal bench, and seeing this development in your lifetime as a graduate of Columbia Law School. What does it mean to see the nation go from a Constance Baker Motley to a Ketanji Brown Jackson?
Yeah. Well, it's so fitting that you ask about her, because I think it illustrates the journey that women, so many women, have traveled in our country. There are still glass ceilings that we are working to tear down. And I have not had the fortune or privilege of working with the late Constance Baker Motley, but she is one of my sheroes. She was a longtime civil rights lawyer who worked alongside the guys. She worked alongside Thurgood Marshall and so many of the luminaries from the civil rights movement. She played a role in Brown versus Board of Education. She argued a number of cases before the Supreme Court and won all but one of them. And frankly, she had an across-the-board set of wins at the end of the day, because the one case she lost, the Supreme Court ultimately reversed its position on. There's some things we share in common. She graduated from Columbia Law School. She is the daughter of immigrants. I look up to her and think about her as I carry out my work as a civil rights lawyer. As you note, she was the first Black woman to ever serve on the federal district court, but we've never had a Black woman on the United States Supreme Court. So it is remarkable to think about that journey between Judge Motley and the journey that Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson is on now.
You are the Assistant Attorney General in the Civil Rights Division. Can you tell us about the Civil Rights Division? I believe I read somewhere that it was in 1957 that this division was created. So give us a little bit more of the history of the Civil Rights Division.
Yeah. Well, let me take a step back and share a little bit about the history of the Justice Department.
Okay.
Founded about 150 years ago. And some of the very first cases that the Justice Department took on were cases, you know, pursuing white supremacists and the KKK and extremists that were using racial violence to target Black people, to drive them from their homes, their churches, their communities. So here we are 150 years later, still doing that work. And the Civil Rights Division is the engine for a lot of that work inside the Justice Department. We use our nation's federal civil rights laws to ensure that all Americans have access to opportunity. We use our federal civil rights laws to fight discrimination and to stand up for victims of discrimination and for our nation's most vulnerable. We're talking about everything from fighting hate crimes to fighting for fair housing opportunity and equal educational opportunity. We're talking about holding law enforcement officers accountable when they violate people's civil rights or constitutional rights. So we have a broad mandate inside the division, but it is really about ensuring that everyone has equal justice under law in our country.
So the Civil Rights Division is one of how many divisions within the Justice Department?
Yeah, there are probably about a dozen or more litigating divisions inside the Justice Department, and we are the anchor for a lot of that civil rights
So you
work.
are a litigator
We are a litigator.
within the division.
Yeah, we are inside the courts carrying out this work. We are using the laws that Congress gave us, the Fair Housing Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act. We are putting those laws to work to stand up for vulnerable people across our country.
So I have to ask you, because I'm not a lawyer, although I've worked for many of your friends and former colleagues, but just recently Congress passed a federal anti-lynching law. Would that come under your division in terms of I guess enforcement? If someone is lynched tomorrow, would that come under your division as something that you would oversee?
Yes, there are some provisions in the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act that give us tools, that give us additional tools to stand up to racially motivated violence and other forms of bias-motivated violence in our country.
Are you the first black woman to serve in this position?
I am the first black woman to serve in this position, to have been confirmed for this role.
That is amazing, and I just had to bring that out because many of the students don't know that I've known you as a lawyer and as an advocate and as a very strong and powerful leader on civil rights and voting rights and equality, but to see you in this role, what has the transition been like over the last year of your life, going from being, one of the leaders advocating for civil rights and voting rights protection to being inside the Justice Department, someone who's overseeing the entire civil rights enforcement of the United States of America? What is that like?
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, it's a privilege and a joy. It is great to work for our Attorney General, Merrick Garland, and to work for an administration that truly cares about civil rights enforcement. It's an honor in that, my first job out of law school was working at the Justice Department in the Civil Rights Division, traveling to your state, Louisiana, and other parts of the South, working to protect voting rights, working to address hate crimes and police misconduct. So to have this opportunity 20 years or so into my career to go back and return to the Justice Department and to have this opportunity at this unique moment in our country, right, where in 2020 we saw demonstrations and protests in every corner of our country, people who wanted that light shining brightly on injustice. To be in this role serving at this moment in particular is a deep honor and a deep privilege.
Recently I was over at the White House and I had an opportunity to meet Lloyd Austin, and I said, there are only two people in the cabinet that I really don't know, and I said, the Secretary of Defense and, of course, the Attorney General of the United States. And on both, I met with Mr. Austin and I said, you're doing a fine job. And I said, if you see Mr. Garland, I want to also share that information. He's doing a fantastic job. But talk about the first year. Let's talk about that first year in office. You all have had to oversee a lot over the last 12 months. Federal hate crime laws, civil rights laws, voting rights laws. But give us an idea of some of the most important challenges as well as accomplishments over the last 12 months at the Justice Department.
It's been a busy year. I'll tell you, you know, I feel like we are firing on all cylinders. Dedicated career servants at every level throughout the Civil Rights Division who care deeply about enforcement of our federal civil rights laws. Some of the accomplishments, recent accomplishments that I'm most proud of, Ahmaud Arbery.
Yes.
The tragic killing of Ahmaud Arbery. You know, Georgia did not have a hate crimes law on the books when Ahmaud Arbery was killed. And so we used our federal authority and jurisdiction to bring federal hate crimes charges against the three men who took the life of Ahmaud Arbery. And we secured convictions. A jury found the three men who were responsible for the death of Mr. Arbery guilty of federal hate crimes charges and attempted kidnapping charges.
Can you tell our audience why it was important to, after these three men were convicted in state court, to charge them with a federal hate crime? And tell us a little bit more about that statute and why this was a historic decision as well.
Yeah. Hate crimes are unique. They're not ordinary crimes. They don't just target individuals. They really target communities and send a message that they are not wanted. And so it was important for the United States to pursue federal hate crimes charges here, to tell the rest of the story, to ensure that America understands that this was not just a man who was killed. This was a man who was killed because of his race, because he was Black. The evidence that we brought forth in trial showed that these three men harbored racial animus. One of the defendants used racial slurs. Another used the N-word to describe his daughter's Black boyfriend. Another tied Blackness to criminality and expressed views wishing that Black people would be killed or harmed. It was important for us to tell the other side of the story and to make clear to others who would dare target people because of their race or because of their religion or gender, that the federal government will hold you accountable.
So you had to get a grand jury to indict these individuals, and then it went to trial.
That's right.
In which they were later convicted of the crimes.
That's right.
I mean, again, being a non-lawyer, this process was very intensive.
Very, very intense. And the prosecutors who worked on this case worked day and night to leave no stone unturned to ensure that they could bring forth a full story to the jury. The jury listened to the evidence and returned a guilty verdict. And, you know, it's a tragic story. The only justice here is truly for Ahmaud Arbery to be with his family right now.
Correct.
But when you think about hate crimes throughout our nation's history, I talked with you about some of the work that the Justice Department took on 150 years ago. We think about Emmett Till, we think about James Byrd, and here we are with Ahmaud Arbery. I mean, this has been a long stain on our nation's history, and so we have a commitment at the Justice Department to use every tool in our arsenal to stand up to hate crimes, which we know are a real problem across our country today.
You recently testified before the United States Senate. You gave an update on COVID-19 hate crimes. Tell us more about, you know, the rise in incidents of hate crimes in this country and what the Justice Department is doing to try to, I guess, alleviate or stop the crimes from occurring, but more importantly, how you're educating the country about these new incidents of hate crimes.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I talked about in the testimony was just new FBI data that shows that hate crimes are at their highest level in nearly 2 decades. We've seen a spike in hate on the basis of race. Black people continue to make up the majority of those who are targeted because of their race. We saw a 70% increase in hate targeting the Asian American community. We saw an increase in crimes targeting people because of their gender identity. So we've got real work to do. And part of what we're doing are the criminal prosecutions, holding people accountable. And we're using laws like the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Hate Crimes Prevention Act to do this work. But there are also hate incidents, things that may not rise to the level of warranting a criminal prosecution, and we can't ignore those incidents. So one matter that I'll give you as an example is a matter that we handled recently in Davis, the Davis School District in Utah. Black and Asian American students made up about 1% of the student population, respectively. And we uncovered hundreds of instances of racial slurs being used against these students, assaults against students of color. And so we went in and put in place a consent decree that requires a number of reforms and overhaul of policies to ensure that students in that school district have a safe learning environment going forward. Every student deserves a safe learning environment.
Yes.
Churches, we're seeing our houses of worship targeted. 3 historically black churches targeted in Louisiana some time ago. The church, the Poway Synagogue, mosques. So we're also using our authority to hold those accountable who target people while they are engaged in peaceful worship inside their churches, their synagogues, or their mosques.
With regards to hate crimes, I know you are also following the developments that's taking place on several HBCU campuses, including Howard University, the recent bomb threats. I think there's even in Louisiana last week, there was even additional schools that had to stop academic programs or at least shut down events because of, more threatening calls and so forth to these institutions. What's going on with regards to protecting HBCUs and other institutions from these increasing threats that they're facing?
Yeah. Well, this matter is with the FBI. The FBI's counterterrorism unit is handling this matter. I know that there are more than half of the field offices, half of the FBI field offices across the country that have been activated and are looking at these threats. But as I was just saying, every student deserves a safe learning environment in our country. And so I do know that the FBI is bringing all of the resources to bear to look into those threats.
Last month, a jury in Minnesota convicted 3 of the officers involved in George Floyd killing and violating Mr. Floyd's federal civil rights. Explain the significance of these convictions. And are federal lawsuits like this one going to, I guess, be the answer to ending, well, I should say not ending, but holding police accountable and ending police brutality?
Right. Yeah, another tragedy. George Floyd should be alive today. Right. And we secured a guilty plea against Derek Chauvin, but we also brought federal charges against the 3 officers that stood and watched as George Floyd died. And we secured convictions against those 3 officers. And I think these convictions are important because it makes clear that law enforcement officers who under color of law violate people's civil and constitutional rights will be held accountable. And it's not just the officer who uses excessive force or deadly force without basis. It can also be the officers who are bystanders, who fail to intervene, who watch and do nothing, even though their training may dictate otherwise. And this is about holding officers accountable for not just their acts of commission, but for failing to act,
Most of Americans would like to see us honor and respect those men and women who take the oath to protect and serve us, but there are a lot of Americans who are skeptical right now about what's happening with police reform or criminal justice reform. And can you tell us anything on the administrative side of the law? I know you're not on Capitol Hill, you're not a member of Congress, but what's happening within the community at large and holding these police departments accountable?
Yeah. Well, we know that the vast majority of law enforcement officers carry out their jobs nobly. They wake up to protect and serve. But when you have officers who violate the law, who violate people's civil and constitutional rights, it's important that we talk about accountability and push for accountability. And so that's what we do inside the Civil Rights Division. I know that there are conversations happening around criminal justice reform. The George Floyd Justice in Policing Act is one example of that. We saw Congress recently pass the Violence Against Women Act, which also gives us some additional tools in our arsenal at the Justice Department to stand up to real threats. But we need a holistic conversation that is not just about prosecutions and accountability, that is not just about policy making and reform, right? It's also about, protecting victims, right? And making sure that they know where to turn to if they are targeted, making sure that they speak up and speak out. We know that a lot of crime victims, particularly hate crime victims, don't report, and in part because they're not confident that law enforcement will take their claims seriously. There is the need for training, and we have parts of the Justice Department that focus on strengthening training for law enforcement.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about other tools that the Department of Justice can use to help move the needle while this conversation may be stalled on Capitol Hill, but perhaps there are other ways in which we can make sure that there's real credible reform that the community can trust. Because I think you're right, the overwhelming majority of Americans would like to work with law enforcement and protecting their communities. But they're also worried that there's not enough being done.
Yeah. Well, we can't abandon the effort. We got to keep pushing. And I think that your students who are watching, stand to play an important role in these conversations. We need everyone around the table when it comes to, finding the best path forward for ensuring public safety and for ensuring that we have constitutional and sound policing in our country. Finding strategies where we can strengthen trust between communities and law enforcement. It's going to take all of us.
And my Uncle Nat, if he was here, he was a proud New York City police officer and retired serving on the force. He would always tell us that we have to work together if we're going to keep our communities safe. One other area that I know that you've been involved in, and that is redlining. And I understand that the Justice Department has outlined some new initiatives to address this issue. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. The Attorney General joined the Civil Rights Division for the launch of a national initiative, the Combating Redlining Initiative. And this is about standing up to a long-standing problem in our country where you have banks and lending institutions that fail to offer equal access to credit and loans to communities because of the people who live there, because of race. And this is a long-standing problem that we've seen in our country for decades. Ensuring equal access to loans and credit is key if you care about economic justice. These are really critical issues.
How do you dig into this? I mean, we had Secretary Marcia Fudge here a couple of weeks ago, and we talked about her efforts to ensure that every American have access to the type of credit they need and lending so that they can invest in home ownership. We know that this is one of the largest, one of the most important ways that people can accumulate wealth. Yeah. So I think it is a very important issue, and I'm glad that the Justice Department is addressing it. But how can we be more vigorous in the enforcement? I mean, it's almost like a deadly disease that nobody understands. I mean, I recognized when I was a kid trying to figure out if I was going to buy my first house, and when I went through all of the steps, my God, it was one of the most difficult experiences I went through.
Yeah.
But how do you know that these efforts are happening, that they're redlining, when it's often, sort of like invisible, off the grid. How do
Yeah.
you investigate that?
Yeah, it's a tough issue, and I think it underscores the important role that government plays here, because often what we're doing is we're relying on data.
Okay.
Data sometimes that comes to us from other federal regulators who look and study how banks are extending loans and who they're extending loans to and who they're not. And often we'll get that data, and then we'll go in and we'll start to investigate. We'll start to look at things like, where are their branch offices located and where are they not? Where are they marketing loans to and who are they not marketing loans to? And eventually, we sometimes uncover stark racial disparities that make clear that institutions are engaged in unlawful redlining. I think it's important for consumers to be aware that this is a problem. You may not know if you're victimized, but if you suspect that you've been treated differently and suspect that that may have been because of your race or because of your familial status, the fact that you have kids, for example, it's important to speak out, file a complaint with HUD, file a complaint with the Civil Rights Division or with a state regulator that may be focused on these issues. It's an important complement to the work that we do looking at kind of the data and overall patterns that explain how banks are operating in different communities.
I'm so glad that you're doing that, because had someone told me when I started to save up my money to buy my first house that I had certain rights, it would have saved me a lot of pain and agony. I'll never forget looking for a house here in Washington, D.C., and everybody kept telling me, oh, but go across the river. I said, I love across the river. I hope to go over there one day and buy a house, but right now I need to live closer to my job because I wanted to walk to work.
Yeah.
And it took me a while before I could find a house. And thank God I was just persistent on getting a house. And this is an effort that I'm going to continue to follow up on because I think it's important. One area that we have to address before we open it up to a couple of students who are here with us is the issue of voting rights. That's an issue that, as you know, it's part of my life's work as well. And we touched on it briefly, but I believe that voting rights and the right to vote is the most important issue of our time. Our democracy cannot function if people are denied the right to vote and have access to the ballot. I don't have to explain this to you. You've taught me so much about making sure that every American have access to the ballot. So what are you doing? What is the Justice Department doing? You in your role as Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, but more importantly, what's happening on the voting rights front across the country?
Yeah. The right to vote, one of the most important civil rights in our democracy. And we're using the laws that we have. We're using the Voting Rights Act of 1965. We're using the National Voter Registration Act and other laws to make sure that all Americans have access to the ballot. We are watching redistricting efforts as they unfold across the country. We are looking at states that are adopting laws that make it harder for people, particularly for Black people, Latinos, and other people of color to vote and access the ballot. We filed lawsuits in a number of states across the country and statements of interest where we're helping courts understand how they should be applying the law in these cases. But the truth of the matter is that we lost one of our most important tools with the 2013 Supreme Court decision, Shelby County, Alabama versus Holder. It's why we support the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act that would put back in place one of the core provisions of the Voting Rights Act that was brought to a grinding halt by the Shelby decision, the Section 5 preclearance provision. That provision of the act had helped to block right at the outset hundreds of discriminatory laws that had been adopted in certain parts of the country, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama,
Yes.
Georgia, South Carolina. It blocked the discriminatory redistricting plans. It blocked the efforts to move polling sites to hostile locations and so much more. So we do need restoration of the Voting Rights Act so that we have all of the tools that we really need to ensure that every eligible American has voice in our democracy.
What do we do in the interim with, I guess, in 19 states, 300 laws? What do we do in the interim to protect individuals who are preparing to go to vote this fall? What steps should they take? What tools do they need to ensure? Because 2 years ago, they were able to mail in their ballot or drop it off at a regional or perhaps local ballot box. And now the laws are changing.
Yeah. 50 states, and the rules are different across the board when it comes to voting. So, one thing I think is important is for people to check their voter registration status, confirm their polling site location, confirm the dates and time for voting in their communities, know what's on the ballot so you're prepared when you get there. Those are some things. And I know that there are students watching, and the rules vary, but if to the extent that you deem your campus your home, that may give you the right to register and vote where you attend school. If you deem home, somewhere else, you have the right to an absentee ballot. And so making sure that you know the steps that you need to take to vote in your particular community, in your state, is important. And what we're doing at the Justice Department is we're using the laws that we have to make sure that we are pushing back against some of these efforts that make it harder for eligible Americans to vote.
What can we learn from other nations that perhaps could help us figure out how to modernize our voting system, how to create a new system whereby every 4 years, every 2 years, the American people don't have to undergo a whole sea of changes with regards to our right to vote? Is there anything that we can learn from other nations, or do we have to just depend on the United States Congress figuring it out over the next 30, 40 years?
Yeah. Well, I believe that we want America to be kind of an emblem of democracy.
You mean we shouldn't pay a fine if we don't vote like they do in Australia?
Yeah. I think it's important that we keep pushing to make sure that we are a model, to make sure that every eligible American can participate and have their voice heard and their ballot counted. And so we're going to keep doing that through our enforcement work while hoping that Congress can do their part by restoring the Voting Rights Act.
That's a good answer. And I guess in listening to your answer, you're telling me that we have a lot more work to do to ensure that our voting rights laws keep up with a changing country that, pretty soon, I'm still a member of DNC, the Rules Committee, and pretty soon people will want to get up and just cast their ballot online the way that they can now go online and go to the grocery store.
Yeah, we got to keep pushing. I think it's not just with respect to voting rights, it's hate crimes, and on so many issues, we've just got to keep pushing forward. There's been, I think, tremendous progress over the decades, but I think today we see so many reminders that there's still a lot of work to do when it comes to fighting discrimination and ensuring equal justice under law for everyone in our country.
When you think about the 21st century and how we're going to adapt to all of the technological changes and all of the other things that we know are happening in the world right now, what will civil rights look like 50 years from today?
Yeah.
Civil rights laws, civil rights practices, and for someone like yourself who's steeped in being a litigator and someone who's been a strong advocate for protection of equal rights under the law.
Yeah. Wow, what a question. I would love to think that we won't need a civil rights division 50 years from now. I'd love to think that we're leaving the world in a better place and in better shape for, my son, for our grandchildren. But I think that the story of America is one where we're constantly reminded that we've got to keep pushing forward, that at any moment there's the risk of backsliding, that we've got to remain vigilant, that we got to be mindful of the new and evolving challenges that we face as a country. So I can't predict where we end up in 50 years, Donna, but I think it's important that we never abandon the project of working to make our nation a better, more fair and equal place.
When you hear people say that democracy is on the line, you know, President Biden recently held a democracy summit. What does that mean, democracy is on the line? Can you explain to the students why it is so important to be advocates of democracy, especially now, given all of the things we know that are transpiring and taking place in the world, including the invasion of a sovereign nation by another nation?
Yeah. Well, I know for the students who are watching, many of them may be studying the Constitution, right, which is the anchor document of our democracy. The right to free speech, right? That is the right that gives us the ability to go out and peacefully demonstrate and protest. The right to equal protection under law. The right to vote free from discrimination. You know, all of this work, I think, is what makes our democracy great. And we want a world in which these are not just principles that we aspire to, but real rights that are tangible for everyone. To me, that's what democracy is. It is constantly working to breathe life into the Constitution, so its promise is made real for everyone in our country, regardless of their race or their gender, their national origin. That's to me what makes democracy great, and something that we gotta keep working at.
I can't believe I've been talking to you for over 40 minutes without opening it up to students, and I know I have a student who would like to ask a question or two, but is there anything that keeps you up at night as it relates to civil rights, the state of our democracy? I have to ask you this because you have been such a strong leader, a strong proponent of equal access to the ballot box, of civil rights and voting rights and the respect of the Constitution, the rule of law. But, I have to ask a simple question. What keeps you up at night? Because in many ways, you are our protector. You are our defender. You are basically serving in a capacity to make us safe. And as a child who grew up in the South, who worried, like my parents and grandparents, that somebody could not come home at night, that they may get stopped, or somebody might mistake them for somebody else, and we would never know what happened unless, God forbid, the unfortunate thing. So what keeps you up at night?
Yeah. I think civil rights is about making the quality of life better for everyone, particularly for victims of discrimination. But on the far end of this work, right, is loss of life. Yeah. Hate crimes that result in loss of life. Yes. Police shootings, yes, right, that result in loss of life, where you have deadly force used without basis. That's work that kind of keeps me up, thinking about grieving families out there who should have their loved ones with them today. And so waking up, it's the stuff that keeps me up, but it's also the stuff that wakes me up. Very proud to have this opportunity to serve and work at a Justice Department, our nation's highest law enforcement agency, where we have the ability to use our federal civil rights laws to try and make our country a better and more safe place for everyone.
I know I sleep better at night knowing that you're there, that Judge Mary I said Justice, but unfortunately that didn't come to pass, but I do feel better at night knowing that you're there, as well as Judge Garland and so many other of your colleagues that I know are committed to equal justice under the law, and I want to thank you for answering. That was a childhood question. That had to come out of my spirit because that kept me up at night, just wanting to see my dad come home. Yeah. Praying with my grandmother that he came home, yeah, because he was a black man. Yeah. And knowing as a little girl that when he got off that bus at night and had to walk home, We just wanted him to cross that track. That first track was to just get him back into the neighborhood. The second was to get him into his home. And the fear of growing up thinking that somebody could take your dad away, simply because he was a man. And my dad he was a tall guy, but he had served in Korea and came back with Bronze Stars and medals, and it didn't matter because he was a black man and they called him something else. But I'll never forget the joy of seeing my parents and grandparents celebrate the fact that they could vote. And had they lived to see me talking to you, this would be a moment that they would make gumbo. And we would have jambalaya, and we would have a good time. Well, we said it another way in Louisiana, but you all know it's a good time. All right, so we have a wonderful young lady, and she really wants to ask a great question. So thank you for being with us this evening.
Of course. Good evening. My name is Alana Thomas. I am a graduating senior legal communications major, English minor from Boynton Beach, Florida. And first and foremost, thank you for taking the time out to come speak with us today. As a future lawyer and pre-law student, it is exciting to see the work you're doing that affects not only the community of color but the community across the nation. So my first question is, can you talk about the work your office is doing with the census and redistricting cases, and how is it affecting the nation?
Yeah. Thank you for that question, and an early congratulations.
Yes.
Exciting that you are almost at the finish line, and excited to hear about your interest in the law. So the Census Bureau, every decade they generate data which tells us how the population has changed, shifted, and grown throughout the course of a decade. And lawmakers across the country are using that data right now to redraw maps. They're redrawing maps for city councils and county commissions and state legislatures and Congress. And what we do in the course of our work of enforcing the Voting Rights Act is we look to make sure that lawmakers are not redrawing those maps in ways that will harm or discriminate against voters of color, against black voters, Latino voters, Native American voters, and other protected groups. We have seen historically that jurisdictions will pack voters of color into a single district, for example, to deny them the ability to have influence and opportunities to elect in neighboring districts. We'll see jurisdictions that crack those populations so that in communities where you may have racially polarized voting, where white voters historically vote one way that stands in opposite to the way that voters of color vote, they'll crack those voters so that they're without the opportunity to elect candidates of choice. So we're using the Voting Rights Act to ensure that we have fair maps across the country. And one thing that people can do is be vigilant. If you learn about redistricting happening in your community and there is an opportunity to participate in the process, make sure your voice is heard. Go out and learn what they're doing, understand how those maps are being drawn. But our role at the Justice Department is ensuring compliance with the Voting Rights Act. The census data we use in lots of different ways. It gives us a lot of information about how the population has shifted, but that's one way, one specific way that we use it in the course of our voting rights work.
Thank you. It kind of goes to my follow-up question. As a native Floridian and the current legal battle going on with the governor's redistricting map, has the Department of Justice, weighed in their opinion or plans on getting involved if it is to pass?
Yeah. So we don't talk about our pending investigations, but what I can encourage you to do is to visit our website, usdoj.gov, and take a look at the Civil Rights Division's page where you can see some of the recent activity that we've undertaken across the country.
And my final question, it's a bit more sensitive subject. Recently people have found out that the Emmett Till case will not be reopened. And I guess I want to ask if you can provide a little context on why the Department of Justice decided not to do that.
Yeah. So, yeah. The tragic killing of Emmett Till is a stain on our nation's history. We didn't have a lot of the civil rights laws and hate crimes laws on the books when young Emmett Till was killed. The Justice Department has investigated this matter throughout the years, and more recently, for a third time, reopened the investigation to look into allegations that were brought forward in a book. We had FBI agents, we had prosecutors thoroughly and comprehensively evaluating the claims that were set forth in this book, and ultimately did not find a new basis to pursue charges or to recommend to local or state officials that they could pursue charges. But I want to acknowledge that the death of Emmett Till is a tragic that looms heavy for so many across our country. And I think about Emmett Till in the course of doing our hate crimes work. I think about James Byrd.
Yeah.
I think about Ahmaud Arbery.
Yes.
And we have a duty and an obligation to use the laws that we do have on the books today to stand up for hate crimes victims and to work to hold perpetrators of racially motivated hate violence accountable.
Have you applied to law school yet?
No, ma'am. I decided to take a year off. I actually speak with you afterwards.
Yeah.
Pursue either fields within political campaign work. Val Demings is running within the state of Florida, so I would love to join her campaign, or just within different government offices. I'm currently on the Hill working for Congressman Al Lawson, so I'm just keeping my options open before taking that trip to law school.
Excellent. I'd welcome the chance to talk with you. We need more good lawyers out here, particularly in government service and public service, so I'd be pleased to speak with you.
Thank you.
And I'll be pleased to talk to you about Val Demings' campaign. Some of us love politics and campaigning, and I'll leave the legal stuff to my good friend here. I want to ask one final question, because you've been very generous with your time, but the question comes from Nigel. He's in the class of 2022, will be graduating. He's also a native Floridian. He's been accepted to Howard University Law School, and Nigel wanted me to ask you about students who aspire to follow in your footsteps, and I say your heels. What advice would you give to young students here at Howard University? We have so many students who are graduating this spring, and many of them aspire to be lawyers and go to law school.
That's great. Well, what I can say is that the law is a powerful tool for helping to promote change, to promote justice, to stand up for victims of discrimination. And I think that for those who are watching, who are interested in using the law to advance the public good, there's a lot of work to do. There's working for the federal government, state and local government, working for nonpartisan, nonprofit civil rights organizations. So I am encouraged and excited to hear that we've got young Thurgood Marshalls and young Constance Baker Motleys out there who may be thinking about careers in the law.
I've been reading about Pauli Murray lately, and her amazing legal theories and legal work, and she's another one of those sheroes. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't mention Vernon Jordan, another proud graduate of Howard University Law School, who has mentored so many of us, and I know you were familiar with Vernon's work as well. Well, I want to thank you for joining us. This has been an amazing conversation. We could go on, but clearly I need to go to law school one day so I can ask you some more questions. But we've run out of time, and I want to thank everyone for participating today, especially Madam Assistant Attorney General Kristen Clarke. I keep trying to call you Kristen Clarke, which is your name, but Kirsten is my niece, and I'm trying to get her to go to law school. I just got one niece out of law school. I'm trying to get another one, and I have a nephew in medical school. So as you can see, Auntie Donna is quite busy. But thank you, Assistant Attorney General Kristen Clarke, for your leadership, and also for just being an outstanding public servant in all that you do. I also want to thank the team here at WHUT TV and all of the students who participate in the King Lecture Series. Once again, thank you, Colbert and Gwendolyn King, for your leadership in establishing this program here on the campus of Howard University. We're immensely proud and thankful that you were able to participate in today's important conversation and to help shine a light once again on Black excellence, especially when that excellence stems from Howard University. God bless you. We'll see you soon. Thanks again.